My name is Matt Reed. I'm part of the Sprint communication team, and I'll be appearing throughout this webinar, just introducing speakers, answering questions, keeping everything flowing nicely. So you'll see me and hear me throughout the next 90 minutes. I am not alone. I am pleased to say that working alongside me virtually, there are a whole team making sure that this is all going smoothly. So deep in the background, we have Jane, who's kind of acting as the producer. You'll see Charlotte, who's handling technical questions and is on the chat, and we will be responding to you. And we have Honor, who is out in the Twitterverse, live tweeting this, so making sure that other people can join in and take part as well. So we're all here to make that run smoothly. So you will see this as we progress through. So I'm going to start in a moment with some housekeeping and some what we're going to do next. So please, I can see that people are arriving still, and you're very welcome. So we'll just give people a moment to come in. But those of us who are already in the room, it might be a nice thing to rename ourselves if we haven't done already. If you could put your first name or your given name, then your family name, and then your organization if you represent one. So you can see that on mine, you can see that on Jane's and other people's. It's just a nice way so we know who's in the room, other people know who are in the room, and helps people know who's here with us. So if you would like to give that a go, that would be great. Thank you very much. So can we move to the slide that just sets out the agenda, please? Thank you very much. So as you can see, we have quite a packed 90 minutes, so I'm moving quite briskly, but we're going to start off with an introduction to Sprint from Vera, then Beatrice from the FAO is going to talk about FAO's role, and then Rex is going to come in and talk about EU policy context, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. So please do be posting your answers or your questions in the chat. We'll try and pose some of those, answer some as we go, and there will be a chance for you to have some of those questions posed to our speakers. Then we're going to have a second session, which is Paul talking about the impacts on human environmental health, Jakob talking about how Sprint has got a global health risk assessment toolbox, and then Anna will talk about transition pathways. And then again, there will be another chance for your Q&A sessions before we close, and we'll talk about some next steps then. So that's where we're going, and I'm hoping that's very clear to you, but please don't worry, we will make sure this unfolds for you in that manner. So then can we have a look at some ground rules, please, on the next slide? Okay, just a few ground rules. We're asking you to keep your videos and your microphones off if you're not speaking, and we'll invite you to speak if that's appropriate. Just so that lowers the bandwidth, we're conscious that different people will be on different levels of internet connectivity. So if we can keep this low, we can be inclusive and keep people taking part. Please, as I say, post your questions in the chat, say who you're addressing it to, and then we'll do our best to answer those. If you have other comments, if you want to just say hello to people, or you've got some ongoing points that you'd like to make, please pop those in the chat. We have people watching those all of the time. So, you know, that's really important that we get a chance to participate. I'd also say that this event is being recorded. So again, you'll get a chance to watch it again, listen to it, and think about it if there's something came up that you want to go back over again. If you have any technical questions, then you can email Jane at jmills@glos.ac.uk, or the telephone number is there. And so please feel free to contact us if there's some big technical problem. And if you are a Twitter user, if you're a social media user, please jump on at SPRINT-H2020, and you'll see Honor taking this to the Twitterverse. So that's how we're going to proceed, just to make a little bit of housekeeping so everybody knows where we are. So those of you who've just joined, if you can, just rename yourselves, as I suggest, just add to your name here, your given first name, your family name, and then any organization you represent. That just really helps us navigate what we'll be doing. So just to get us started, we're going to run a few fun polls so you can take part and let us know something about yourself. So Jane, can we have the first poll, please? Okay, we'll just give you a couple of moments just to start answering those. Where are you? Which part of the world are you from? Latin America, the Asia Pacific, North America, Europe and Central Asia, Africa, North Africa, the Near East? Okay, get polling away there, please. That would be fantastic. And oh, let's see, we're not doing so well on the Americas at the moment. Anybody? No, presumably if you're not from the Americas, you can't claim to be. So that's great. Lovely. Okay, a few more people could answer. Jump on in if you've just arrived. Okay, just give that a moment more. Okay, let's just end that poll, please, and then we can see where's everybody's from. Okay. So overwhelmingly, oh, actually, it's a tie. It's a tie. It's an absolute tie. It's a tie between people from Europe and Central Asia and people from Africa. So welcome, everybody. We have a smaller group of people who are in the Asia Pacific, and then we have one person representing North Africa and the Near East. Welcome. And one person representing Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, very welcome. Nobody from North America. Maybe it's a bit early for them. So thank you very much for that. Can we have the next poll, please, Jane? Okay, so what do you represent? Do you represent a government body, an international organization? Do you represent a private company? Are you in academia? Are you in an NGO? Or do you do something else that we haven't quite worked out? Okay, keep going. We'll do this for a few more minutes. We've got a few more people to participate. Please come on in. I can see that people are still coming in. You're very welcome. I appreciate that sometimes it takes a moment or two to get onto Zoom. Okay, I think we've almost finished here. Few of people. Last call for people to participate in this poll. Okay. Let's close this poll now, please, Jane. Okay, so we have a lovely spread of people. We have a lovely spread of people. Quite a few academics. And we've got quite a few academics, 20 people are academics, and then we've got 16 people from international organizations, but 9 people from government bodies, 5 people from public sector, private sector, and 8 from NGOs, and then 5 people representing other organizations. So that's great. That's really nice to know who we've got with us today. You're all very welcome. And I'm sure that this will make for a very interesting discussion between us all. So we're going to move on without further ado to our first speaker, who is from Sprint. And this is Vera. Vera is a researcher at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on the distribution of pesticide residues in soil and the environment risk assessment of pesticides. She is the scientific manager of Sprint and is involved in pesticide work in the Soils Africa project and the 2015-2018 Lucas survey. So there would be nobody better to talk to us about Sprint than Vera. So over to you, Vera. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for the introduction. I will share my presentation. I hope you can see it. Full mode. Okay, super. Thank you. Yes, so I'm presenting the Sprint project. First introduction to you on behalf of Professor Dr. Gillette Guyson, the project coordinator, and the whole coordination team. And if you don't know Sprint yet, well, Sprint is a project on sustainable plant protection, and we use a comprehensive global health approach here. It's a Horizon 2020 project. It's a 5-year project that started on the 1st of September 2020. It's a 15 million euro project, and we have 28 partners across Europe and Argentina with different transdisciplinary expertise. So the overall aim of the Sprint project is to develop and test a global health approach to assess risks and impacts of plant protection products, PPPs, also commonly known as pesticides, on ecosystem, plant, animal, and human health. We are also working to identify transition pathways towards more sustainable use of PPPs. So how are we doing this? Well, besides the expertise of our team, we are also looking into 11 representative case study sites across Europe and one in Argentina. You can see here their location in the map in the right. And these case study sites have different crop systems, different pedoclimatic conditions, and are also referent to different regulatory areas. In each one of these, except for Argentina, we have conventional and organic farming systems, and we are doing comprehensive sampling and monitoring in there. One of the strengths of our project is the fact that we address the challenge at the mixtures level. And this means that we that we do analyze multiple compounds. Actually, are looking for more than 200 pesticide residues in our field samples, and we are also looking into mixtures at ecosystem and animal and human laboratorial tests. So in the ecotoxicological and toxicological assessment, using their tiered approach. In the SPRINT project, through the whole project duration, we are engaging with different actors. So we have produced this scheme that represents a SPRINT train with the different food system actors included in the different wagons, and we are engaging and exchanging with them through all the project. Another key point of the project is that we do look into health from a holistic perspective, using 3 main indicators to define it. These are resilience, reproductivity, and also the manifestation of diseases, once again, across ecosystem, plant, animal, and humans. In the project, we have 10 interlinked work packages, which cover areas from stakeholders, distribution of these PPP residues, also exposure, ecotoxicological assessment, health risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis, transition and policy recommendations, dissemination, coordination, and all the ethics requirements required to perform the work. I think that gives you a brief overview of the project. And stop sharing the screen now and back to Matt.
Thank you very much, Vera. That's really great. Thank you. Now, if you have questions for Vera, then you can pop them in the chat and we will come back to Vera in a few moments for the Q&A session. So thank you, Vera. And I can see we've still got people joining us, so you're very welcome. And we're going to keep going. So our next speaker is Beatrice. And Beatrice, you've probably seen in your email box if you've managed to come this far. So it'd be very nice to hear from her directly. Beatrice works for the FAO on various pesticide management issues. She's involved in normative activities related to the FAO, WHO, International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management, and in field projects, particularly in West Africa. She deals with many aspects of the pesticide life cycle, such as registration, residues, compliance, and enforcement, biopesticides, obsolete pesticides, soil remediation, and container management. Beatrice is also coordinates the activities, development, and training of the FAO Pesticide Regulation Toolkit. So that's hopefully a useful introduction for you. I'm going to hand you over now. It's all yours, Beatrice.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for attending this webinar. And indeed, I'm going to explain the FAO involvement in this EU project, the importance of being associated with such innovative activities, and how FAO participates, and how FAO could integrate some of the outcome of SPRINT into its current more global work. So next, please. So just to, as a way of introduction, well, as you've seen in Vera's presentation, FAO is one of the many, I think 28 partner partners in SPRINT. And well, of course, FAO is, unlike many other organizations, is not a research institution, but is more policy oriented with a strong technical base. And its a role here is also, it's a complementary role to other partners, and to give this global dimension. And I think it's also the link between research and policies is really important, because eventually the outcome of the sprint should fit into a regulatory framework. Well, of course, the EU regulatory framework, and we will see if feasible, if relevant, how it can also be integrated into the FAO framework. Just to give you an idea, I mean, we'll hear more about the Horizon 2020, which is a funding EU program. But SPRINT is not the only project in which FAO is involved. As you can see in this list, the FAO is involved or has been involved in various other projects. You can see the creative title, Blue Cloud or Bike, etc. But basically what I mean is that it's dealing with many other areas like marine research or biofuel or genetic resources, underutilized crops, etc. So it was just to also give you the context that FAO is also involved in other projects of the same kind. Next, please. So before covering how FAO is involved in SPRINT, I just want to go through quickly the FAO activities, and you will see how they can be relevant to SPRINT. Well, at the global level, well, FAO is deeply involved in promoting sustainable production and protection. Well, not only sustainable, but also efficient, resilient, and inclusive, with the goal of protecting human health and the environment. And over the last 30 years, regarding pesticide, I mean, the importance has been, the focus has been to minimize the risks of pesticide at each step of the life cycle. There's this life cycle approach, which is very important. And it's also a way of promoting IPM, agroecology, biopesticide, and more recently and more importantly, mainstreaming biodiversity aspect into agricultural policies and agri-food systems. And of course, also working on pesticide, it's also to ensure, making sure food safety and nutrition is ensured for everyone and for consumers. Next, please. So in terms of FAO activities, the first important aspect of the activities deals with more the normative part. Is basically dealing with developing guidelines and standard of conduct, like the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management. We do that together with the World Health Organization. And that's the blue book you can see on the slide. And this blue book is accompanied by a number of guidelines, guidance, and tools on all aspects of pesticide management. Important is also it's also the work on pesticide residue evaluations, and this also this is important in terms of those evaluations are being used for setting MRLs, maximum residue limits in food by Codex at the international level, and also we work on pesticide specifications, so to ensure quality control and safety. And the way we work, I mean, we work with large networks of countries, government primarily, regulators, but also observers, NGOs, industry, academia, and so on. Keeping in mind that our main target audience for all those guidelines and tools, even if they apply to everyone, and the target audience are the the regulators, the policymakers, and also the farmers in low and middle income countries. Next, please. One key tool I would like to highlight today is the FAO Pesticide Registration Toolkit. And the reason is that, I mean, it was basically the initiation of our involvement in this project, because the University of Wageningen approached FAO to be involved in the sprint through this toolkit initially. And that's also what we will do eventually to make the link with the project. For those of you who are not that familiar with the Pesticide Registration Toolkit, it's basically an online handbook. It helps all those involved in evaluation and in registration to take informed decisions. So it's a decision support system. It includes a lot of information about pesticides or about assessment methods. We keep developing new parts, new modules. More recent one on assessing risk to soil organism. And what is important is that also we have a training program associated with this toolkit, meaning that if at some points we integrate and link the Sprint Toolbox that Vera has mentioned, and you will hear more about it later on, if we make this link, it also means that the Sprint outcomes will be disseminated through our training program. Next, please. And beyond the normative activities, we have all the field activities that are also a way to disseminate and to build on the normative, the guidelines, the normative work, guidelines, etc. So it's all the capacity building and technical assistance FAO provides to low and middle income countries through either projects, and project can be short or long and several years long, and comprehensive or on specific aspect, trainings as well, and also this participatory approach, the farmer field schools, which are really there to strengthen farmers' innovation capacity. That's also an important part of our capacity building work. And we give all those support on all those aspects, as just mentioned, on the pesticide life cycle, risk reduction, also on the Rotterdam Convention, as FAO as the co-lead secretariat together with UNEP. On important aspects like the highly hazardous pesticides and also IPM alternatives, biopesticide, and so on. So that's important to have that in mind, because again, the outcome of the sprint at some points when they are integrated in some ways in the FAO work, they can be disseminated through field activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of how FAO is going to be involved in the different work package, WP, the work package of Sprint, well, not in all work package, but in some specific one, like work package 5, that you will hear about. You will hear about this tool later on developing the Sprint Toolbox, the Global Health Risk Assessment Toolbox. And we will be testing, once developed, we will be testing the global applicability of that toolbox and see how we will make the link to the FAO registration toolkit I've mentioned. FAO is also, will be also involved or see how the recommendation that will come out of the work package 7 and transition paths and policy recommendations. So policy recommendations on we could integrate into international policy guidance on pesticide management. So how to support the transition towards a more sustainable plant protection. And we are also associated on the work package on communication and dissemination. I mean, like today's event, I mean, having some more global events, and also, as I said, in field activities. So next and almost last slide. So the FAO involvement and interest in SPRINT is really that SPRINT is investigating new innovating areas at both the technical and policy level. At the technical level, as you've just heard, I mean, it's really interesting to see how the risk has been assessed when they are for assessing the cumulative effects from multiple exposure and also mixtures of pesticides, and we know this is a challenge. And also the other interesting aspect is that Vera mentioned, and you will hear again, is this One Health aspect. I mean, how to assess for all the different compartments, the ecosystems, the plant, the animal, and humans together. And I said the areas in terms of policy, so how to inform policy aspect about transition paths towards more sustainable plant protection, and it will also help us improve our technical tools and update our guidance. So next and final slide, I think. It's thank you for your attention. I hope you'll find this webinar interesting, and you will see the opportunities it provides to be involved or to be informed about this project and also for the future of plant protection. So thank you for your attention.
That's great. Thank you very much, Beatrice. And welcome to those people who are still joining us. Just to say that if you are still joining us, we are recording, so whatever you may have missed, you can come back later and see. So you're very welcome. And that was a really helpful introduction. Please, as people are doing, pop your questions in the chat that we'll deal with very shortly. So we're going to move to our next speaker, who is Rex Horgan. And Rex works for the European Commission in DG Sante, which is Health and Food Safety. And he works in Unit 3, which has a particular responsibility for the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, known as the SUD. This directive has been undergoing a better regulation evaluation and impact assessment of its planned revision, as announced in the Commission's Farm to Fork strategy. Efforts to reduce the use and risk of pesticide and better protect and assess risks to health and the environment from pesticide use are central to implementing those policies. So I'd like to welcome Rex, who's going to talk us through his role and the relevance of SPRINT to the Commission's work. Over to you, Rex.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. Hello to everybody, and thanks for the invitation to speak at today's event. Because I've limited to 10 minutes, I think, for my presentation, I'll be going through the slides quite quickly, but I understand that attendees will receive the slides afterwards, so you'll be able to go through them in more detail yourself. So we can go to the next slide, please. So first of all, a few words on Horizon 2020, as mentioned by Beatrice. This is quite unusual in that the stakeholders are really very actively involved in these research projects, and there's almost like a bottom-up approach that stakeholders identify issues and get involved. And you're probably aware that the use and risk of pesticides is quite a sensitive and controversial topic within the EU, and I think in other parts of the world, with very divisive and polarized opinions. That's why the outcome of the SPRINT project, in terms of an improved global risk assessment methodology, will be very important to our policies going forward. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So I've listed here various Commission policies and initiatives. It's not an exclusive list, there are others, where somehow reducing the use and risk of pesticides and better protecting health and the environment is quite central to all of these policies. So we can go to the next slide, please. And in particular, the farm to fork strategy stated that the use of chemical pesticides in agriculture contributes to soil, water, and air pollution, biodiversity loss, and can harm non-target plants, insects, birds, mammals, and amphibians. And the Commission proposed specific targets to be achieved by 2030 to reduce the use and risk of pesticides. And there's been a lot of discussion about these targets. And for some people, they're too ambitious, and for some people, they're not ambitious enough. So the Commission has to chart a path between these quite polarized and divided views on the use of pesticides. So we go to the next slide, please. And the farm to fork strategy, again, you can find this document on the internet, you can read all the details, but it did include some specific actions concerning pesticides. For example, the planned revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, revision of implementing regulations to facilitate placing on the market of biological active substance, plant protection products, revision of the pesticide statistics regulation, recognizing that really data is fundamental to our policy formulation process and evaluating if a current policy has worked or not worked or to what extent. And then in terms of impact assessing how an amended policy in the future might work or might achieve the goals. And also the international aspects are very important here, and sustainable food production is really quite a growing issue internationally. So we go to the next slide, please. But thinking back within the EU, many of these objectives are not entirely new, and we've been trying to achieve them for some years now. Back in 2006, the Commission proposed a thematic strategy on the sustainable use of pesticides and had the following objectives. And really, I would say all of these objectives are still valid today, which means we haven't been entirely successful since 2006 in achieving them. So quite more work to do, we could say. So we go to the next slide, please. And in the context of more sustainable food system, there is this 2020 scientific opinion produced by the EU Group of Chief Scientific Advisors towards a sustainable food system. And I thought the first statement here is quite relevant or notable, that the EU's food system has achieved high levels of food security, food safety, and wide consumer choice, but is currently not sustainable with respect to the environmental, economic, and social aspects. So continuing with business as usual will significantly endanger natural resources, our health, the climate, and the economy. So in terms of current discussions around the issue of food security and resilience, et cetera, it's quite relevant to bear all of these points in mind. So we go to the next slide, please. So I work mainly on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, better known as the SUD. And there was a specific action in the farm to fork strategy that the Commission would evaluate, okay, how the SUD has worked in practice. It was adopted in 2009, so it's been implemented for quite some years in the EU. But among stakeholders, there's certain disappointment or frustration that it hasn't really achieved the objectives, their expectations, what they hoped from it in terms of reducing the use and risk of pesticides and better protecting health and the environment. So we set out to, first of all, evaluate the current SUD, how has it worked or not worked, and then impact assess how we might revise it going forward. Now, in terms of the evaluation, there are certain criteria you look at. Relevance, okay, do we care about pesticides anymore, or we're more interested in other things? Is this piece of legislation coherent, complementary to other EU policies? Has it been effective? Has it been efficient in terms of the costs it has imposed compared to the results it has achieved? And then is there EU added value, or should the Commission, the EU, just leave it to EU member states to take their individual national actions? So we go to the next slide, please. So the outcome of the evaluation, as presented at a public June 2021 stakeholder event. In terms of relevance, the objectives of the SUD to protect health and environment were and still are highly relevant. Coherence, the SUD is quite coherent with other EU policies, but improvements are possible as regards links with the Common Agricultural Policy and biocides. In the original SUD, there was a provision that the scope of the SUD might be extended in the future to biocides, but it never actually happened, and biocides is being dealt with in other EU legislation, which is going to be subject to an evaluation in the near future. Then in terms of effectiveness in achieving its objectives, the SUD has only been moderately effective. In terms of efficiency, the costs have been proportionate, so it didn't impose really excessive costs on stakeholders or pesticide users. And there was a broad consensus that there is a clear EU added value for action in this area. So we go to the next slide, please. And then the evaluation identified four main problems. That really the SUD, it was proposed by the Commission in 2007, agreed by EU member states and the European Parliament in 2009. But really, so many years later, it doesn't fully reflect the new ambitions of the various policy documents I mentioned earlier, such as the European Green Deal, Farm to Fork Strategy, etc. This issue of monitoring and data availability is still quite a difficult issue, and member states and pesticide users are worried about administrative burden or costs of collecting such data, issues of confidentiality, etc. Then we had the issue that the directive was not, we could say, fully effectively implemented in all member states. There was variation, there were delays. These have been the subject of reports by the European Court of Auditors and resolutions from the European Parliament. And there have also been a number of European citizens' initiatives collecting more than 1 million signatures of citizens in the EU, that more action is needed by the Commission. And then the issue of new technologies not being sufficiently taken up by pesticide users. So certain technologies might be able to reduce the use and risk of pesticides, but some stakeholders believe that the directive, it didn't encourage and maybe even prevented or impaired the effective implementation of such new technologies. So we go to the next slide, please. And we've done various online public consultations. We had 2 external studies supporting our work. And there are really different views, we could say, among stakeholders. Some pesticide users and members of the pesticide industry consider that pesticides are safe when used correctly and important, and that there's really no great need to reduce their use. If they're authorized, approved, they're on the market, they should be safe when used properly. Whereas some, we could say, non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, citizens really would like to see chemical pesticides, their use greatly reduced or even phased out. And so if you look, we've published the results of these online public consultations on our website, and you can read the results, and it's quite interesting to go through them. We don't have the time today to go through them in detail. So we go through the next slide, please. So I've mentioned these other sources. The European Parliament Research Service did a study on SUD implementation, identifying some weaknesses, the European Court of Auditors report, and the European Commission itself. We do audits, fact-finding missions to member states. We report to European Parliament and Council. So there's a general sense that people have been disappointed with the implementation and effectiveness of the current directive in terms of protecting health and the environment, and there's a pressure to improve our policy framework. And we would see this outcome of the SPRINT project as contributing to that. So the next slide, please. So I think where this links in with the SPRINT project is, I mean, how to clearly identify, assess, quantify, and communicate these risks to health and the environment for pesticide use. As I said, pesticide users and pesticide industry, many of them would say, look, these pesticides go through a very comprehensive scientific assessment before they're put on the market. If they're put on the market, they're approved, they're authorized, they should be safe when used properly. So really, why do we need to reduce their use? We use them only when necessary, and if they're not safe, they shouldn't be on the market. And on the other hand, we have consumers where pesticide use really ranks very highly in terms of consumer concerns when you do your barometer surveys or surveys of public attitudes. And then in terms of impact assessment, there have been a number of economic studies modeling what would be the impacts of reducing pesticide use. And there's quite an interesting paper from January 2022 on modeling the transition to sustainable food systems. And it can be quite easy in terms of modeling, okay, a reduced crop yield or crop quality and what would be the costs of that. But then in terms of quantifying what would be the benefits to health or the environment or society from improved ecosystem services or greater biodiversity or improved health, etc. I think that's an area where we need more data, certainly. So we go to the next slide, please. So I think I've mentioned this already, where we see that the SPRINT project can be complementary to the objectives of our various policies and initiatives. And the Commission were active across very many fronts, we could say, on this issue, including under the Common Agricultural Policy and the national strategic plans that member states are required to produce. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and I think we're going to have time for questions now. Thank you.
We are. Thank you very much, Rex. I really appreciate that. It's very difficult to explain some of these things in very short order, and I appreciate that the clarity which you brought to that. So thank you very much, everybody. We have a few minutes for questions. There are some fantastic questions coming up in the chat, some of which we're able to answer immediately, which is fantastic. So thank you very much. And you can see some of those going on now. So I just wanted to pick up a few questions for people. So let's start with Vera. Vera, I just wondered if you could say something, because people are interested about how SPRINT is going to relate to activities in developing countries. And you mentioned that SPRINT has a partner in Argentina, which I appreciate is very different from other places, but equally is outside of the European regulation that Rex was just talking about. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the role of the Argentinian case study would be?
Yes, thank you, Matt. Yeah, indeed, this is an EU-funded project, so therefore most of our case study sites are indeed in Europe. And we included Argentina because Argentina imports a lot of feed into Europe. So there is also here a route of exposure, and therefore we are also looking into PPP distribution in there. I hope that addresses the question.
That's really great, thank you. And I think also some of the questions that have come up about human health and regulation and risk, our colleagues from SPRINT will directly deal with in a moment. Yeah. So I'm just holding off so some of those questions. So thank you, Vera. Now, this is a question for Beatrice. Beatrice, what's the distinction between a pesticide and a herbicide? I know that sounds perhaps a bit philosophical for some people, but I think it has a very practical application.
Thank you, Matt. Well, basically, the pesticide is the broad category, and it includes herbicide. Herbicides are to kill the weeds. So herbicides are one subcategory of pesticides, and you have also insecticides, molluscicides, other kind of sides like that to kill whatever. And just want to react on one questions about the gender. I don't exactly know the question. That was about the gender-based constraint to access in access to knowledge on pesticide, and also the different risks depending on the gender. And my colleague Christine Schul from the Rotterdam Convention Secretariat just mentioned ongoing work on addressing gender issues in pesticide management. And that's also, I know gender issues are important in SPRINT. It's also important in FAO at different level, but also in terms of risks, pesticide risks. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Beatrice. Rex, you just, I think, answered a question in the chat, but would you like to say something just briefly about whether pesticide use is increasing, decreasing? What's happening with pesticide use within the European community?
Okay, so when we bring forward a piece of legislation, it has to be accompanied by an impact assessment where we have done the analysis and we say, okay, the impact is going to be X, Y, Z. And the original SUD proposal in 2007 was accompanied by such an impact assessment, which, based on all the evidence and data and the measures foreseen, expected that pesticide use would go down very significantly in the EU. And then that didn't actually happen to the extent foreseen. So now, again, we're looking at the data. Now, we have data at EU level on pesticide sales. And then we have what's termed harmonized risk indicators, HRI 1 and 2. And I've put the website links on the web. It's quite detailed. You can probably read about it. But I mean, pesticide use sales, we could say, are fluctuating, probably a generally downward trend, but not as significantly downward as we would have expected from the policy. And that's why we're looking at the policies again to try and make them more effective.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rex. And I hope that helps with everybody with their sort of background understanding of why we have SPRINT, why everybody is interested in this. And although it may not be immediately addressing an area that you're living in or working in, that maybe some of its impacts in time will reach out to you. So thank you very much, everybody. We're going to move to the next section now of our webinar today. I'm going to start introducing colleagues who are working on the SPRINT project, and we'll give you some more detail about what's happening. So next up is Paul, and Paul is an associate professor in risk assessment and molecular epidemiology at Radboud University in the Netherlands. His research group investigates which environmental factors are likely to affect our health. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Paul.
Hi, Matt, thank you very much. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm very happy to meet you all in this webinar. I'm now moving, let's say, from the overall goals and context of the project to the methods that we are going to use to answer the questions that we are hoping to answer. And one central method that you probably know is the method of risk assessment. And I'm going to, let me see, I'm going to first address how risk assessment is defined. So the good thing about risk assessment that globally we all use the same terminology, but it's rather difficult terminology. So I would like to make entirely clear what we are talking about. So, and first I would like to stress that we need to make a distinction between risk and hazard. So actually the hazard is the property of a substance or a mixture. So in this case, the pesticide substance or mixture. But to translate that to risk, we need to know more about where this substance is located, where we are located, to what extent we have direct contact, directly or indirectly. Good thing about this whole concept of risk assessment is that it can be applied to human health, but also to so-called non-target species, so any other species that is not supposed to be, let's say, the target of the use of the pesticide. That can involve ecosystem species and includes the overall biodiversity. So we will, based on what was introduced already by Vera, we will collect data from 10 European countries and from Argentina to find out about risk. And maybe I should, at this point, just emphasize why we added Argentina to our collection of countries. Well, in Europe, we use plant protein as feed for animals, and most of that is imported. And one of those countries is actually Argentina, as one example of, let's say, a country that produces soya, for example, as a protein source. And we would like to include the pesticide residues in that product as a source for, let's say, residues that we expect in animal feed. So that would potentially expose farm animals, but also including the farm environment, that can include maybe pesticide residues in dust from feed. And what we do, and I think that's a really big task that has already been completed last year. We have collected many samples. We have collected all the samples during the use period. So that would be the growth season from different crops. And we have collected samples from the environment, and most of those photographs that you see from different European countries and Argentina are actually from those field campaigns. But we've also collected samples from humans, from farm animals, and from those non-target species. And the next slide shows an overview of the different types of samples. Most of the samples relate to the environment. So let's say where we encounter pesticide and their degradation products in environmental compartments, but also, and that's maybe interesting for exposure assessment, also in those contact media. Those can be in those environmental compartment, but also, let's say, our home environment, where we use silicone wristbands to make an assessment of that direct or indirect exposure. And what we're also going to do is collect samples from blood, urine, and feces, which is quite unique. That's called human biomonitoring. And that's a way to look at internal exposure from many different sources at the same time, integrating also over time. And this will help us to predict our risk. And maybe interesting to know that we have selected the farm cat as the ultimate, species for sampling. And maybe I should explain why a farm cat. Well, we have seen from previous work that cat owners are likely to be higher exposed by two routes. Let's say one would be, let's say that the cat potentially brings to our home those residues when going out in the field of the farm. And secondly, that, let's say, we have a connection to our pets, and that makes us, and we have found indications that, for example, we found higher values and more frequent contamination of our hands when people actually had a cat in the home. So that's maybe just a good example of how we are looking at exposure. And then next step, let's say, going from the field to the laboratory, we will test those levels and for those pesticides, and also the mixtures that Vera was talking about, to see what impact they have on species from the ecosystem, and also in animals that we use as a model to predict effects of pesticides on humans. Those are usually rats or mice. And maybe you know that in this type of research, we expect to find relationships between the exposure level and the effect, the response, we call it. And that is, you see in the right top corner, you see this so-called dose-response curve. And that is the key information we are looking for to make predictions regarding the health impact. And that's the last step for the risk assessment that, let's say, here we try to make the connection between risk and hazard. So the hazard, we just take that from existing databases and mainly using guidance values to protect health or to protect the environment. But let's say the big contribution that we were trying to make in the SPRINT project is that we are going to make predictions regarding exposure. And we do that based on the field data that we collected. And then we are plotting this information in this so-called risk matrix. And on the X, you see the exposure level, and on the Y, you see the health impact. That can be on humans, that can be on the environment. And in the I give two examples of circles where I think that pesticide may turn up, let's say, as a result of our work, and that we are likely finding, let's say, some examples of pesticides that have a low exposure and low hazard, that we can, let's say, for which we can make a pretty accurate assessment of the risk. But it's also likely that we have higher exposures over a broad range, maybe more than 2 orders of magnitude, because we are including both farmers and consumers. And you can imagine that farmers may be much higher exposed than residents. And also on the side of effects, we need to take into account some uncertainty. And this is, let's say, expressed by the size of the circle. So we hope in this way to make, to give a visual, let's say, impression of risk. And then, and that's the last slide, we hope to, and I think that next speaker, Jakub, will be talking about that in more detail. We hope then to map these exposures and also the potential impact on health, human health, and health of the ecosystem for Europe and Argentina. And I don't know yet at what, let's say, detail we can do that, but that is to be seen to what extent. But that will be, I think, important way to inform policymakers and also the public about the result of SPRINT. And Jakub will tell you more about how we are going to do that. So that is what I would like to share with you. And now I hand over back to Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really helpful. Just to say to people that please do keep posting your questions in the chat, and we are answering as many of them as we can, and we will sort of send out in our emails answers to whatever we can as well. But it's really fascinating to see people having their questions answered as we go. I'm also conscious that more than 20 people have joined us since we started. So some of you will have missed the beginning. You are very, very welcome. No problem at all for being late. We're really pleased that you're here. And also I know that for some people, your connections will be unstable. So we are recording this. You can go back through, you can have a look at some of the detail, because I appreciate that many of our speakers are sharing a lot of information very quickly. So next up is a member of the SPRINT team, Jakub. And Jakub is a professor at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. He focuses on environmental chemistry and toxicology of soils and pesticides. He is also guarantor of the Environment and Health Study program at Masaryk University. Okay, over to you, Jakub.
Thank you, Matt. I will share my screen. I hope it's okay.
Looking great.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are, I would like to share with you our vision of the Global Health Risk Assessment Toolbox. This is one of the main goals of SPRINT project, to develop something like this with this very nice name, Global Health Risk Assessment Toolbox. Actually, it's a collection of different tools. So I can go to the introduction about the toolbox. So for what this toolbox actually will be developed. So it will be the toolbox for the risk and impact assessment of plant protection products residue mixtures, and that's highlighted here because we really want to focus on the environmental mixtures of pesticides in SPRINT in general, on EPAH health, which stands actually for what you have here, several rows below, of human, animals, ecosystem, and plants health. Let me please a bit also explain this title. So because global stands actually for a maybe more familiar term, integration. So what we would like to do is to integrate both the exposures and hazards in a conventional risk assessment scheme, which was nicely explained by Paul in a previous presentation. So that will be the risk assessment tools. And global actually means that we will try to integrate multiple levels, but also the individual active substances, individual pesticides, to their mixture effects. And we want to characterize the effects not just on human health, for example, but we really want to understand health as something global. So it's a combination of human, animals, ecosystem, but also plant health. So that's we usually abbreviate with this EPAH abbreviation. And toolbox actually means that there is no tool. There is not one single tool, but we want to develop the whole box of the tools. So, and the form will be perhaps kind of platform or system, which will be web-based, and it will be collecting these tools developed. Also important now is to talk about the end users who will be using these tools. And we really believe that from the perspective of the whole project and also the call from the European Commission, that such tools are really needed, especially by the policymakers, also strategy builders, like the experts who are developing the steps within the farm to fork strategy, and then also decision makers, for example, to select from the portfolio of the pesticides, those pesticides who are presenting the lowest or acceptable risk. Then, of course, also the regulators and authorities at the national and international level. But we also believe that a lot of people from industry or science can be interested in the tools which we want to develop. And it was already shown by Vera that we have this nice train of the stakeholders. So the toolbox is can be interesting for everyone in the train, but perhaps the first group is the most important for from the users of the toolbox. And now I would like to briefly go through the individual tools. So the first tool, we would like to collect the harmonized protocols and the guidelines for the performing of the ecotoxicity and toxicity tests, which will be done within SPRINT projects. Some of them are already used in a current regulation, so that's not necessary, but some of them will be newly developed, especially at the higher tier level or with a native species. So we would like to collect the detailed guidelines and present them in this structured library of the guidelines. But also we would like to present the results, which will be measured using all these tests for the mixtures, which will be selected from the case study results as it was presented by Paul. The second tool We plan to develop similar library as for the ecotoxicological and toxicological tests, but this time we would like to focus on environmental fate models. So the colleagues from work package 3 will prepare a library, the commented library of different models. Some of them, they are already used in the pesticide regulation and assessment, but some of them will be newly validated and introduced to the audience. The third tool is the tool which is, I think, very pivotal in the whole toolbox, and that will be our effort to predict or estimate the inputs of the pesticides into the European environment. And this tool will have different spatial and temporal scale, and it will start with the predictions of the pesticides emissions, so starting from the applications of the pesticides according to the national and international statistics, but then also will incorporate some environmental modeling to predict the concentrations in different compartments like soil, water, air. And we also want to check the reality of these predictions using the real data from both the SPRINT case studies, but also from the ongoing monitoring program like Lucas Soil Monitoring in Europe or Water Framework Directive and so on. And as I was talking about these levels of these tool 3, so we want firstly focused on very, let's say, site-specific results. That was also indicated by Paul, that we did this extensive work last year. We collected a lot of samples, have a lot of numbers now processing. So we would like to present all these results in kind of interactive web-based visualization or presentation of these results, and also provide at the same time very nice structured overview of the methods which were used for this huge global monitoring. The second sub-tool of this tool will be development of the regional and national maps, and I can help myself with this nice example from the Czech Republic, where the other scientists already did some estimations of the pesticides. So this is example of one specific active substance and the predicted inputs into the environment, which are based on the crop maps and also the application rates and so on. And then in combination with some data about the substances, we also want to model how these concentrations are developing over the time, depending on the crop. And then this will be predicted how these compounds are transported to other compartments, from the soil to water to air and so on. And of course, not all European countries have sufficient statistics on pesticides data for these. So we will start with the data-rich countries, and perhaps we can also identify some gaps, which we then may recommend to European Commission that it would be really nice to have a complete data for all European countries to perform such modeling for all European countries someday. And then we also have an ambition to go to the European level, which can be either done from, let's say, adding another countries together with the models like I showed at the previous slide, or we can also go from top down, because there exist some global models for the pesticides emissions. So we will see which technique we will finally use for this pan-European maps predicting the concentrations and input of pesticides in European environment. Unfortunately, there are already some approaches, for example, from the Italian colleagues who tried to do that, and they very nicely predicted some inputs of pesticides for several European countries. So we see that it should be theoretically possible. The fourth tool will be going from the exposure, which actually starts with this characterization of these environmental levels, to the risk assessment. And that was really nicely explained by Paul. What does it mean? So we basically will combine the exposure data with the hazard data for the pesticides, and we will try to predict what risk is coming from these levels of the pesticides and these multiple substance occurrence in the European environment to all different groups of organisms as a terrestrial, aquatic organisms, animals, and human. Of course, you can imagine that for human, the risk or the exposure is not just given by the concentrations in soil or water, but it's also combined by the inputs from the food basket. So also the data about the typical levels and inputs of pesticides from the food consumptions, and the same for animals by the feed consumptions. Also, these database will be compiled and introduced to the risk calculation. And finally, when the risk will be calculated again, it will be spatially specific, so we can put it in some risk heat maps or something like that at the European level. Still, we have the risk characterized for the individual groups of organisms. So we have the idea about the pesticides mixtures effect on ecosystem, on animals, on human health. But because we really want to somehow also tackle with this global integration, so we also want to explore the ways how we may put all uncomparable things like pears and apples into the same scale and somehow compare the total expenses we pay for the uses of pesticides in Europe. So we would like to integrate all these impacts and effects in some integrated health impacts assessment. And finally, because during the whole exercise and whole development of the tools, we will definitely collect a lot of different papers, but also the other existing tools and so on. So we also want to take this advantage, and we want to build up in parallel also kind of structured database or library of other existing tools and other important sources which are related to this pesticide, either exposure or impacts or risk assessment. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jakob. That was great, really helpful and really useful. I could see you were answering people's questions in the chat as they heard what you were saying. So that's great. So thank you very much. We're going to press on, and we have our next colleague joining us, who's going to talk now about transition pathways. So good afternoon, Anna. Anna is a senior fellow at the Ecologic Institute, where she coordinates their activities surrounding agriculture and the soil. Anna specializes in the implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy, rural development programs, and the Water Framework Directive. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, so I'll give a very brief overview of what we're doing in the SPRINT project on developing ideas around transition pathways towards more sustainable plant production. Be a very, very short overview. Next slide, please. So we have three main aims in this area. One is to propose transition pathways and then develop specific policy and regulation recommendations, as well as propose a research agenda on plant protection in close collaboration with the European Food Safety Authority. Next slide, please. Sorry, it seems to have some animation in there. Can you just go through, Charlotte, just so we get the whole, apologies for that. Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, so we have three main elements to our work. One is we're analyzing what kind of barriers and lock-ins we have in the current situation that prevent farmers to reduce pesticide use, and this can relate to economics, consumption patterns, agri-food policies, risk assessment and authorization, for example, lack of alternatives or very slow authorization of biocides as alternatives. Then there's also barriers around availability of knowledge and research and innovation related to alternatives, as well as the increasing climate impacts and biodiversity loss that increases susceptibility to pests and diseases. The second task is to map and analyze stakeholder visions on what sustainable plant protection might be, a sort of an end goal that we want to aspire to. And then also analyze successful examples already of transition. This is both at farm level, so the different types of farmers who have either transitioned completely away to organic farming or who have transitioned to really strongly reduced use of pesticides. But it also involves looking at cases of, for example, how supply chains, value chains have been redesigned to enable farmers to do this transition. The third task then is to work with stakeholders together to develop ideas around and concrete suggestions for transition pathways for the different sprint farming systems. As Vera and others have shown, we have various case studies that we're working with within Europe and in Argentina. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the method that we're applying, it's our work is really just intensively starting now. We've done quite a bit of literature analysis already on what this state-of-the-art knowledge is around barriers and solutions. We are starting to conduct stakeholder interviews, starting first at EU level and at national level, and then at a later phase also in the case study areas. We will also have an online survey, and we're developing an approach to conduct various types of workshops and case study, and then we'll case study areas, and then we'll bring this together to feed into the different tasks. What I'd like to just underline, which has already been mentioned, is that this approach really very strongly relies on interaction with different types of stakeholders along the farm to fork whole supply chain. And of course upstream as well, and that we work closely with case study partners to try to get as concrete insights into how this might work, how the transition could work in the different types of farming systems, because they face quite different challenges. And I would leave it at that. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Lovely, thank you, Anna. I'm sure there are questions. We're going to move to a question and answer session now for a few minutes. So we're just going to lose the screen and come back to everybody. Let's do that. So let's just start off with a few questions. Jakob, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but we'll say, Jakob, there's a really pertinent question about will the toolbox be effective in developing countries where they might not have the baseline data? Would that be something that the toolbox would be able to accommodate?
Yeah, of course, thanks for the question. It depends what the baseline data stand for. However, we see even in the European countries that some things are harmonized by the regulation. So we have some data in all the European countries, let's say at the same quality. But for the construction of some tools, we still need some other data which are not defined by the legislation. So in some countries, they are from the national purposes collected pretty well, but in some other countries, they don't. Why I'm telling this? Because we want rather to develop a concept and show the concept on some example data-rich countries or regions. So I really believe that this concept can be then transferable to other countries, and it then just depends if you can collect the appropriate data, or you can maybe also slightly change the concept of the calculations to work with some other type or higher or lower resolution data in a tools. So I believe why not?
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Now, so for Paul, you talked about many different groups in your presentation. Could you say something about how Sprint might be dealing with the impacts on children?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a very good one. we have discussed this in our project. I think, let's say, many of us have concerns. We mainly have concerns about let's say, early life stages, but also on school-going children and school-going children and children play outside, and maybe also enter fields where they could become exposed. So we are relying on most of our, let's say, predictions for exposure. We are relying on modeling, but the data that we will be using is all based on the data collected in adults, because we really thought that it would not be a good idea to let's say, involve children because of the burden of the work and of the, let's say, the materials we would like to collect. So we will try to assess situation for children based on extrapolation from adults by modeling, if that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think that's really important. It was a question relating to how children were exposed in their food, but I think it raised a really important question about, you know, we're all concerned for children in this situation, but as you've said, there are practical and ethical problems of involving children, but they're certainly not being ignored in the SPRINT project. So thank you very much, Paul. Question for Anna. How will the views of stakeholders and their interpretation of sustainability be used alongside the other research findings? How are we going to incorporate kind of qualitative aspects into the work?
Well, that's the qualitative aspects are really the core part of the work. So we are conducting interviews, we're doing then transcriptions of these interviews, and we'll be conducting a qualitative coding analysis to try to identify different types of visions. And then once we have these different types of visions and sort of hypotheses for different transition pathways, we will be validating, testing these then in specific workshops to try to see how much consensus we can get among the different types of stakeholders. So, I mean, the research will show both areas of consensus, but also areas where, you know, there's contestation of different arguments. And yeah, so stakeholders' views are really a very central part of the work.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we are now coming to the end of this webinar. So I'd just like to thank all of our presenters. It's been absolutely fascinating, a really great set of dynamic and interesting presentations. I'm conscious that for many of us, we might want to go back and look at some of the detail. So as I said, there is a recording and we will make you aware of where and when that is available to you, so you can go back through it at your own leisure and maybe pull out some of the things that you're most interested in. We have had a fantastic question and answer session, which we will be capturing. I'd like to thank everybody taking part in that. I know that some of the people replying were very well qualified to both make the reply and ask the question, and there's some really useful links there, so thank you, everybody. So that was really helpful, and we will follow those up as best we are able to make sure that you get access to those answers and to those questions. I appreciate that some of those questions we will need to dig into in a little bit more depth. Some of them relate to technicalities, such as, you know, how chemicals behave in the environment and how we model and understand those. Some of those relate to ethical questions that, again, we'd be very happy to answer, but we are running short of time. So what I'd also say is please do keep in touch with us. You have a number of ways in which you can do that. We have a very good social media presence, so you can follow us on our SPRINT website, which you can see on screen. You can get in touch. We have a generic email address, which people do monitor and answer, so don't fear that it's just been sent into a black hole. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is a great resource, which will be a digest of all that's going on, links to what we are doing, links to the papers we are publishing, all in one very handy and useful space. Thousands of people, I think, are already signed up to it, so please do join in. And then across social media, we are on LinkedIn, we are on Facebook, we are on YouTube, and we are on Twitter. So you can, get a daily dose of Sprint, or almost a daily dose of Sprint, and follow the progress as it goes. But as we have mentioned, there will be other online events where you will be able to invite to take part, and we will be making sure that people hear the message about Sprint and its development. So you have been great audience today. I've really appreciated the patience that you've shown in being great in turning off your monitors, your cameras, and also, keeping quiet all the way through. So that's been great and really helpful, and some brilliant questions and respectful discussion, which is always exciting to see in something that can be so controversial and polarizing. So on behalf of the whole team, thank you very much indeed to everybody for their presentation. So thanks to all the presenters today. Thanks for the technical team in the background, who hopefully you haven't really seen too much, but that's Honor, Charlotte and Jane, who've all been busy in the background. So thank you very much indeed. We're going to end in a couple of moments. You can see on the chat that we will be sending links to all the presentations, okay? And really value your time, and thank you for joining us. So wherever you are and whatever time of day it is, I thank you for your time. Please look after yourselves. Please stay well in what remains a difficult time for many people. And we really appreciate you taking part today. So thank you very much.